Good evening, everyone in Alberta, Canada, and beyond. It is Wednesday, January 31st, 2024. And I'm Kerry Lambert, and I welcome you to an online webinar, Evening of Solutions for a New Alberta, brought to you by the Alberta Prosperity Project, also known as APP. APP's purpose is to educate, inspire, and unite all Albertans, businesses, and organizations to protect the prosperity, individual freedoms, rights, and sovereignty by empowering the Alberta government to restructure Alberta's relationship with Canada. Of course, we couldn't do any of this without your help. And if this is your first webinar, thank you very much. It feels like it's been our first webinar in a long time, but only because we've actually taken a little bit of a break. If you remember back in December, we did 3 weeks of kind of the best of. And then last week, we ended up being at the Tucker Carlson event, which is an amazing thing all to itself. And we'll talk about a little bit about that in a minute or two. But of course, you know, if you are watching this and you do like what you see and what you hear, please share it. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Rumble, as well as after we upload these tonight, we'll be on other audio and video sites such as Apple, Spotify, Vimeo, etc. These webinars do take time and effort, and we're starting with sponsorships on our webinars. If you'd like to sponsor an upcoming webinar, you can get in contact with us at contact@albertaprosperityproject.com. I'll throw that up on the screen here as well. As soon as I find it. Or you can even send it to me. You can just go carry@whistlestop.truckstop.ca, or that's the one that I'm looking for here. It is contact@albertaprosperityproject.com. The other thing I want to bring up today is our website. If you want to know a little bit about everything that Alberta Prosperity Project is about, please go to our website. It is at albertaprosperityproject.com, where you can find out some of the stuff that we'll be doing. Of course, we had Tucker Carlson in last week, sponsored that, as well as if you go to the events page here, as soon as that clicks in, events, and you can find out what's going on here. We've got, of course, this webinar tonight. We've also got a whole bunch of Alberta Pension Plan. I get those confused. I say APP. Not only does APP stand for Alberta Prosperity Project, but it now stands for the Alberta Pension Plan. So APP does APP, if you want to call it that. And we are doing events in Barnwell this weekend on Friday. And then a couple of weeks later, we're doing Caroline on the 17th. And then we're doing Czar on March 2nd. And then Westlock on the 6th. But I know there's actually a few more dates that are going to be put into there. So if you are interested in learning more about the pension plan, not only can you watch this webinar and share, but you can also attend one of our events. I'm going to hide that for a second. And, you know, we were talking just briefly about the Tucker Carlson event. If you are interested in what actually happened there, there's 1,001 videos out there. Just Google Tucker Carlson, Calgary, or Edmonton. Or we even had our, if I can find that here. There we go. If you go to the Chris Carey Show, on the Chris Carey Show site, if you go to episodes, we have Chris Scott from the Whistle Stop Cafe, who is also the interim CEO of the Alberta Prosperity Project, did a report on the Tucker Carlson. You can find that onto there. Just click on that and you will hear him talk all about Tucker Carlson and what he saw and what his experiences were. And I think that's probably all we really need to do in terms of that. We were going to do another event specific to that, but there's so much to talk about. There really is so much to talk about. And the number one thing that people have been asking about, of course, is the pension plan. So with that, I want to bring on our guest tonight, who is basically, the episode is called Strictly the Facts About the Alberta Pension Plan, bringing on Trevor Tombe, who's a professor of economics at the U of C, University of Calgary. He's an author and is also co-director of financesofthenation.ca, and I'm pretty sure we'll be talking about that. So with that, I'm going to bring on Trevor. Hello, Trevor.
Hello, Kerry. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. Now, is this like the number one topic that you guys get at the university?
It's certainly one of the most interesting topics in the province in quite some time. So yeah, it's great that we can talk about it tonight.
And so obviously this is not something you've just, jump on the bandwagon in November. You know what? We should start talking about this and take a look at this. You've been dealing with this for a long time. Do you maybe want to just give a little bit of history about yourself and maybe how you even got involved in dealing with the pension plan?
Sure. So one of my areas of focus is on public finances generally, but Alberta finances in particular. So a lot of work on that over the years. It's certainly a province that sees its fair share of ups and downs. And so it's one of the
Yes.
most interesting provinces or jurisdictions anywhere to think about government finances, the pros and the cons. And there's a lot of lessons we can learn,
Mhm.
both on the good side and some of the risks that Alberta experiences with oil prices. It's been a very interesting
Yes. Yeah.
time in
Yeah.
Alberta for really the past decade.
Yeah.
And the Alberta Pension Plan, that's something that also just didn't come out of nowhere in September. It's been a topic of conversation literally for decades.
Mhm.
And we saw the Fair Deal panel report most recently back in 2020. So that
Yeah.
was almost 4 full years ago, and that report came out in May of that year, recommending that the province proceed with a detailed study of what that might look like. And that took some time for it to be compiled, and then a little more time for it to be released by the government. But that's what we saw in September. So it's really a start
And
of a public conversation, but a long history behind it.
what is the Fair Deal panel and how did that come about?
So that came about, I believe it was formed in 2019 by the former premier, Jason Kenney, who put it together to look at a wide range of issues, not just the Canada Pension Plan specifically, but wanting to look at I guess, the structure of the federation writ large, tour the province, talk to Albertans, hear their concerns, and they compiled a report, provided also some recommendations to the government to try and achieve, I think, in the language of the premier, achieve more fairness in the federation. And that's also not something that's unique to Alberta. That tension between provincial and federal governments is the norm. All the way back to the beginning, you had Ontario's Oliver Mowat having pretty intense fights with John A. Macdonald right at the beginning. So that kind of give and take, that natural back and forth is, that's just the norm in Canada's federation. And that's kind of what the Fair Deal panel was most recently in this province.
Okay. Now, what we talk about here on the Alberta Prosperity Project is what we can do in terms of supporting sovereignty, supporting independence, and this is basically the first step in doing that. That is, I'll say, reachable, right? There's other things that we can do. We can implement our own taxation, our own employment insurance. We can get our own police force, but this one, to me, the pension plan seems to be something that is, I won't say easily attainable, but it's one of those things that with just a little bit of work, we can jump on this. And then because of that, if we can get baby steps into this, then it kind of leads into, hey, we can do our own taxation. We can do our own employment insurance, right?
Well, you're right that Alberta, that any province can
That's right.
unilaterally move on reestablishing, their presence in the public pension sphere. So the only reason why we have a Canada Pension Plan and a national plan run by the federal government is because provinces agreed to a constitutional amendment, or two of them actually, one in the 1950s, one I believe in 1964, that provided that authority to the federal government. But it did so with the proviso that provinces can at any time reestablish their presence in this area, and the federal government can't prevent that or inhibit the operation of provincial plans. And then that's indeed why we see a separate plan in Quebec. That was something that they were not going to provide to the federal government in the beginning. So you're right, it's something that provinces can do. I think, as we'll talk about tonight, I wouldn't characterize it as easy. There's a lot of areas where this as a policy choice become quite complex and uncertain. And I think Jim Dinning, the head of the engagement panel that the province has formed, has called the Alberta Pension Plan a gnarly policy issue because it touches on so many aspects of public finance, on federal provincial relations, on Alberta's macroeconomy. And I should say, both positive and negative. And I think that's what makes it a really interesting policy area. It's like almost every choice we make, not just as a province or a country, but as individuals too. Every choice comes with pros and cons. And I think it's important to think about the full picture to make sure we take appropriate action and make the right choices. And the Alberta Pension Plan is a really interesting area from my perspective, where there is both strong arguments in favor and also real costs that need to be considered.
And of course, I just had a birthday, believe it or not. I just turned 55. Yes, I know, believe it or not.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. So now I'm in this, oh, wow, I actually have to be an adult now and start looking at my pension and what is going on. So
you've reached that point.
Versus people like Chris Scott, who is unable to make it tonight. I actually didn't announce that, but yeah, he's unable to make it for tonight. But he's got a few more years behind me. So, I mean, as much as everybody likes to know about the pension, I'm looking at it not only from my own point of view, but I think everyone should be looking at it from the point of view of their kids, right? Because this is not just something that we're going to do and we're going to change it in 5 or 10 years. Once this is done, this is how we're going to be doing it going forward. And so this is quite an important topic of discussion. And I think that's probably why the Premier has basically said that we're going to be going to a referendum in order to vote on this. And there are certain things that I would say should go to a referendum and certain things that should not. And of course, we can debate that as well. But for something that's this big, it would be good to get everyone's input on it. However, I would like to have everyone that is going to be putting their 2 cents in to be educated on the fact and not be indoctrinated by saying, no, this isn't going to work because then we'll lose all our money as CPP. And that is the end of that. And so with that, this particular episode is called Strictly the Facts. And that's what we want to do. We want to talk about the facts, whether or not, we're going to try and be non-biased, because I think everyone should at least go away with this knowing the numbers and knowing the facts. So that's kind of the precursor to the entire conversation tonight.
Great. Yeah. Well, I'm very much on board with everything you just said there. Actually, excellent. It's because it's such a large scale policy issue, and we're talking about pensions. You might be approaching that time where you're thinking in detail about it, but someone graduating high school right now, they might be collecting this in 2080 and beyond, and living potentially into the 22nd century. So this is a very big policy issue to get right. And that does mean a very hard-headed look at pros and cons, and even thinking about the cons, even if one kind of does support the idea, knowing what those cons are and what the risks are helps in setting it up and managing those risks well. There's a lot of things to consider on both sides of the equation.
So I know you have a presentation ready. I also have the commercial. If people have not seen it, it's about 1.5 minutes long, from the Alberta government, the UCP government. I'd like to play that first.
Let's do it.
Only because I know there'll be some questions in there right from there. And then maybe we get into the presentation. And especially if you know that you've answered some of those questions in that commercial, then we should be good to go. So I'm going to add this to the stage, and then we'll...
Alberta's government is exploring a new possibility, an Alberta Pension Plan, or APP for short. You might be wondering, what's in it for you? You see, in 2020, Alberta's government commissioned LifeWorks, an independent third-party consultant, to review the potential for an Alberta pension plan. Their analysis found many benefits for Albertans. That's because Alberta's young working population and more jobs with higher wages has resulted in Albertans over-contributing tens of billions into the CPP compared to the benefits we've received. This means that Albertans could save over $5 billion in just the first year if we moved from the CPP to an Alberta pension plan. These savings could increase each senior's monthly pension payment, or even provide a large bonus payment for seniors at retirement. Or these savings could be used to save Alberta workers up to $1,425 in payroll deductions every year. And if you're a business owner, small, medium, or large, an APP could reduce the premiums you pay each year by up to $1,425 per employee. Along with more money in your pocket, an APP would be more stable than the current CPP. An asset transfer of over $300 billion from the CPP to an APP would mean a more secure pension for Albertans. And agreements would be developed to allow Albertans to move throughout Canada without impacting their pension benefits. To be clear, there will be no move to an Alberta pension plan unless Albertans approve it in a referendum. It's your pension, your choice. So learn more and have your say at albertapensionplan.ca.
So any comments on that, Trevor, that kind of just come out at you? Or
Yeah, so I think I'll highlight in the presentation some of the key benefits that they highlight in that video. I think it is important, though, to recognize where the benefits come from. And some it notes Alberta's young population with higher earning individuals does create an inherent advantage to sustaining a pension plan in the province relative to elsewhere.
Yeah.
The critical component, though, of the significant drop in the contribution, like the payroll tax that we pay into the CPP, comes from that big $334 billion asset transfer that it noted in the video. And that's where there's some interesting uncertainty about exactly what might occur following an Alberta withdrawal. And I'll clarify where that number comes from. And I've put forward some of my own work on this as well, and came to a very different number than what LifeWorks did. And you can see exactly what it is that I'm assuming versus what they're assuming.
Okay.
And what makes this a really interesting area is it's not obvious who's right, and there's a pretty big gap there. So there's some fundamental legal ambiguity given the way they wrote the act back in the 1960s, which kind of throws a wrench into things, but also makes it a little interesting.
Well, this is great. I'm looking forward to this. So should we just jump into the presentation?
Sounds good.
Okay, there you go. Add it to the stage. And then I think you're in control now.
Yeah, looks like it. Perfect. All right. Well, we had a good intro. I'll just thank you again for having me today. And really what I want to talk about with the Alberta Pension Plan is really steer clear of giving any kind of evaluation of whether I think it's a good idea or a bad idea. I think, like all ideas, it has pros and cons, and we need to think about those with a hard head. And so I'll stick strictly to the facts, talk about what we know, what the data says, where some uncertainties lie, and what we might see going forward. And then I'll kind of conclude also with a reference to what I think of as a useful tool at a website, financesofthenation.ca, that kind of allows you to play with whatever assumptions you want and see what the implications are. You could start with the government's analysis and turn the dials based on what you think is reasonable and see what the implications are for what an APP might mean. So I guess I'll start really just setting the stage around why Alberta is considering leaving the CPP in the first place. And that itself is a big question because it's more than just the dollars and cents. There are other issues involved, some non-economic, around prioritizing provincial autonomy, for example. That is like a normative objective. Being an economist, I'll stick to the dollars and cents, and the financial benefits to Alberta from a separate pension plan really stem from our young population. And so what I'm showing here is the census, the latest census, and the population pyramid that we see for Alberta in gray. And what we're looking at here is the share of the population at different age groups, from youngest at the bottom of the pyramid to oldest at the top. Mm-hmm. And in Canada, that's the purple line. And so if you look carefully at the bottom of the pyramid, you can see that Alberta's got a far higher share of children than the rest of the country, and a far higher share of people in their 30s and early 40s. And that, it bakes in an advantage to a pension plan, public or private, because the contributions made by workers have a longer period of time in Alberta to accumulate within a fund, generating returns to fund the future benefits. And on average, Alberta's got 3 more years before a worker hits retirement and starts collecting benefits than the rest of the country. And that might not sound like a lot, but it delivers a potentially big advantage to a separate provincial plan. And it's also not a new idea. This, I do want to emphasize that it's an idea that we've seen discussed, not just in Alberta, but throughout Canada for decades. If you look in the debates in Parliament in the early and mid 1960s around creating a CPP in the first place, members of Parliament right then in 1964 and 1965 were asking, what would be the implications for a CPP were Alberta to withdraw? It was on the minds of even parliamentarians at the time. that Alberta or any future province might leave the CPP. It came onto the scene, though, in Alberta in the early 1980s, when the Western Canada Concept Party incorporated it into their election platform at that time. But things really ramped up in terms of interest in the idea starting in the late 1990s. And that's when we had a reform to CPP that led to, at the time, a modest reduction in benefits and a pretty material increase in contribution rates in order to prevent the CPP from running out of money by 2015. So there was a report in the mid-90s projecting that the CPP would be fully depleted by 2015, and that really sparked a lot of action by finance ministers across the country of all parties. So Paul Martin and Jim Dinning, Ernie Eves in Ontario as well, working together to do that reform. But because it did involve a large increase in the contribution rate, combined with the fact that Alberta had that demographic advantage, really rekindled interest here around whether or not a separate plan for Alberta would come with potentially large benefits, avoiding what was at the time a large increase in that payroll tax. And so the government in Budget 2000, Stockwell Day, right, 24 years ago, tabling that budget, including within it a lot of pieces of analysis around what a separate Alberta pension plan might look like and what the contribution rates might be and how big the benefits might be and what the risks are as well. So you really laid it out then. It never got any traction after that point. But following 2015, I think it's fair to say that tensions rose between Alberta and Ottawa on a number of files, and redistribution within the federation and whether or not those fiscal transfers in and out in different federal programs were fair or not really did lead to the creation of that Fair Deal panel that Carrie, you and I talked about in 2020. That led to the engagement report. I'm not going to talk too much about that because we just watched the video there, but it's highlighting the potential benefits of an APP. And so this is from that LifeWorks report, about a $5 billion per year savings combined to workers and businesses, reduction in the payroll taxes, equivalent at the high end to about $2,800 a year. And sorry, that's split between both employer and employee, so $1,400 and so each. And the large asset transfer that we saw highlighted in that video. But, and I think I'll circle back to several points of uncertainty through the talk here. Some of these benefits are subject to some risks. And I think the first is what I noted, Carrie, with you just a moment ago, that the government of Alberta has the 53% of the CPP. That's the $334 billion share of CPP assets that Alberta would receive. Whereas my analysis was landing on a number closer to 20%. And that's a big difference.
That is a big
difference.
I'll
explain where that comes from. I'm not going to say who's right or wrong. And honestly, I don't know. They're both reasonable interpretations. Well, reasonable people can disagree over how you interpret the language. And I certainly do like mine personally. But there's a lot of different interpretations that we'll talk about. And the federal government has implemented or asked the chief actuary of Canada to come up with their analysis. So we might see yet a third number, and it might be wildly different from these two. And I'll talk about why that's so important. That $334 billion, that is key. There's also some political risks that are interesting. And this has been interesting to watch over the past couple of months. I won't have any comments here because it's not my area of expertise, but there's big differences across age groups in terms of willingness to think about this as a policy option. And it does tend to decrease as individuals age. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting factors there. I think this is something where the engagement panel was exploring what people's thoughts were in its engagement in town halls, seeing what people's opinions are. So I'll be really interested to see the engagement panels unpacking people's perspectives here, both on the yes and the no side when it reports in a few months' time.
I'm sure a lot of this is just the uncertainty, right? And because people they just don't know, and especially as you get older and you're kind of going, wait, I put a lot of money in and I want that lot of money back.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's entirely natural, especially as you're getting closer to the point where you're thinking about it. I mean, the further you are from retirement, the more abstract a concept it really is. It's hard to even come up with what numbers mean at that point. Or if you're young, there might be concerns like, oh, is the pension plan going to exist in the 22nd century if you're someone who's still in elementary school right now? But this is interesting to watch because as we move forward, we're going to get more and more analysis and more data and credible kind of unpacking of all the nuances of what it might look like. So that uncertainty can decline over time.
Yeah.
And that might lead to a big change in some of these numbers here. But I think you're right. Yeah, at the moment, the uncertainty is pretty high. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
So let me give you a crash course here in what all of this analysis is doing. Like, what did LifeWorks do? What is that report that the government released contain? What does it depend on? What's the chief actuary going to have in their report? What's in my report that was recently published? But well, I won't go into too much of the detail. I'll really try and do this in an intuitive way. All pension analysis is doing is asking whether benefits that we commit to paying when individuals retire can be sustained without a tax increase. Like, is the current contribution rate sustainable decades into the future? So the CPP does this deep dive every couple of years, and they look to the end of the century. And of course, there's huge uncertainty around that. So it's always just a best guess. But it really depends on just a few things. Fertility, right? Obviously, how many newborns are coming on the scene. That matters because higher birth rates means more and more contributors. Mortality, that matters as well because that determines how long people will be collecting benefits. And so higher death rates means fewer beneficiaries. And so thinking about future fertility rates, future mortality rates is very important. For a province like Alberta, we have a couple other interesting considerations. One is migration flows between provinces, which can be pretty big. People moving, and right now, people moving to Alberta in large numbers from especially BC and Ontario. That kind of movement would be relevant for a separate Alberta plan, not really relevant for the Canada Pension Plan, although international migration is. And then the fourth piece is investment returns. That's going to be the biggest item to think about. What are the returns to investments in the future? And what we really try and do as analysts in this space is to do these projections for decades out into the future. And I'm going to show you the latest estimates for the CPP here. And we ask, all right, how much are people going to be earning over all of these decades? Best guess, right now, the best guess from the chief actuary is that Canadians within the CPP, so excluding Quebec, will have earnings of about $24 trillion. That's the bubble there on the left. And they pay 9.9% of that, with a cap and into the CPP, and that's $2.4 trillion. The expected benefits that are going to be paid out to retirees over this span of time, brought down into the present, 2.7 trillion. So you can see there's a gap there. We've committed to benefits that exceed contributions, and that's where the assets come in. We anticipate in 2 years' time that the CPP will have about 600 billion. Sorry, 1 year time. And so 2.4 plus 600 billion, that gives you 3 trillion, which is more than the expected future benefits. So the CPP is deemed good to go. So this gives you a sense of what the analysts are doing, constructing these projections, asking whether the dollars coming in plus the assets give you enough to cover the benefits that are going to be going out in the future. Another way to think about it is to ask, how much assets do you have relative to your spending on benefits, right? The assets are your cushion. And right now the CPP has about 8 times more assets in it than it is spending on benefits. And the tax rate we want to set to sustain a pension plan is one that keeps that ratio stable. So that orange line, not falling too much, not rising too high, that's the sweet spot there. And that's what's called the minimum contribution rate. And I promise I'll try and steer clear of jargon and so on as we go, but that's the magic number that the analysis is looking for. And so when LifeWorks reported, and in the video we saw, they pointed to a 5.9% contribution rate. That's the rate that they think would allow Alberta assets to keep up with spending on benefits over time.
And right now, CPP is 9 or 9.9. Is that
8 point? That's right. It's 9.9, but they have a cushion. And so the minimum that they need is 9.5.
Okay.
I think that's worth thinking about here. 9.5 is that minimum.
Oh yeah.
And the legislated rate is 9.9. And having a cushion's probably sensible. So I suspect that even if LifeWorks' asset interpretation is correct, we wouldn't actually implement the 5.9. We'd implement 5.9 plus something to be a shock absorber.
Okay.
So given the time, I think I'll maybe move on to another point we saw in the video, the over contribution by Alberta contributors, workers, relative to benefits received by retirees that are here. And so that number, it's real data. It's not just from LifeWorks. Statistics Canada collects and reports this number annually. And interestingly, StatsCan's done some great work collecting and reporting where federal revenue comes from and where spending goes for lots of programs since the early 1960s. So if you zoom into the CPP, you get a graph like this. This you can find, it looks a little different in the LifeWorks report, but same underlying data. In orange, this is the net contribution of Alberta residents to the CPP. And so if it's positive, that means you have more younger workers contributing to the CPP relative to elderly individuals. So at first, you could see here, for those early decades, there was always a pretty modest positive gap. There was a couple years there in the 90s when it was negative, but since 2000, it's accumulated a lot. And that gap has been pretty big. So the government in the video highlighted 60 billion. And this is the first point where I'll offer a number that's a little different. I'd say over the whole span of time, 80 billion, because you do want to adjust for inflation. A dollar in the 60s is very different than a dollar
that
today.
That it is.
And 70 billion of the 80 was from 2000 alone. And this is a relevant number because it's going to show up again when we talk about the asset split. You know, this is a number that's going to come back to any province, or in this case, Alberta, withdrawing from the CPP. And so that's an important number here. Great. Now, where it comes from is, of course, also noted in the video. If you have more young people relative to retirees collecting CPP, you're going to have you're going to have contributions that exceed benefits just because, and I've plotted here, CPP flows by age. Young people pay in and elderly people collect. So it's a pretty obvious point. But this demographic advantage that Alberta has is entirely driving the imbalance between revenue and spending. And what that means, or where that comes from, is really twofold. One is, individuals pay as they're working and then they collect when they retire. But there is another component of the CPP that drives a lot of the redistribution that I do want to highlight here. And that's intergenerational redistribution. So older people are receiving a much better deal out of the CPP than younger people do. And what I'm plotting here is the implied rate of return on CPP contributions. If you were born in 1920, for example, and you worked your whole life, the average of what people worked for those who were born in 1920 and retired and lived as long as the average person born in 1920 lived, you would have been earning, adjusted for inflation, a nearly 14% return on those contributions, which is a really good deal. I mean, that's you're locking in a really good rate of return there. Whereas if you're born after 1970, your rate of returns are about 2.3% now. And this is being driven by, a couple things. The contribution rate was much lower in the past. So early waves of workers, they didn't pay as much in. Their benefits were much higher. And we allowed people to qualify and get full benefits without working a full 40 years like we do now.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of redistribution that's going on between young to old. And that accounts for a good chunk of what's leaving Alberta too, just because when we set this thing up decades ago, there wasn't a disproportionate share of the elderly individuals in Alberta compared to elsewhere. But this is part of the redistribution that won't actually be addressed. So this is a component of the redistribution that a separate Alberta plan won't address, because we're committing to pay the same benefits. Even if you're someone who is in Alberta now, born in 1920 or 1930, getting a pretty good deal. That's all locked in. And I on fairness grounds, that's probably the right thing to do. But that's a part of it.
Yeah. So before you change that slide, there's been a couple of people that may have crossed their numbers. We're talking about, well, maybe not. I'll let Trevor answer this particular phrase of question that I'm going to try and do.
Sure.
If people are putting in 9.9% right now into CPP, right? And then when they do decide to take out when they're 60, let's just say that, and if they're only looking at 2.3% as a return, where's the rest of the money? Yeah. Where's the rest of the money? Is it because it was eaten up by inflation? Is it because it's just, that's kind of the way the money works, I guess.
Yeah. Well, part of it is where the money goes, I guess, the question there, the money went to fund the higher benefits to the early waves of retirees, because they didn't pay in enough to fully fund the benefits that they received. So workers, decades past, and I should say actually even today, are paying more than what's required to fully fund their future benefits, because we're compensating for the fact that many of these early waves of retirees didn't contribute to fully fund theirs. So that's point one. And then, for an individual, what your individual return is, like if you were born around 1980 compared to someone born around 1990, there's no redistribution going on between the 40-year-old and the 30-year-old today.
Yeah, you're right.
Because the contribution rate that we have is sufficient to slightly more than sufficient to fully fund their benefits. And so the redistribution between individuals now is largely around how long you live. If you work your whole life contributing and then hit by a bus at age 65, that's a pretty poor return on those contributions. But if you live to 100, that's a pretty good return. So these are averages, and then individuals will have a lot of variation around these.
Okay. I think that answers the question anyways. Yeah.
Great. All right. So now what might an Alberta pension plan look like? And so here recognizing the time, I'll kind of jump through what I think of as the relevant slides here. And one relevant one is just to illustrate how important demographics is. And the simplest possible public pension plan you can imagine is just one that every dollar workers pay go into fund retirees. And let's imagine that everything is static and the number of workers we have is fixed and the number of retirees, like everything's nice and static. And if you want to replace, say, 25% of earnings upon retirement, which was what the Canada Pension Plan did, then basically you'd have to contribute 25% of the ratio between retirees to workers, which in Canada right now, it's about 20% retirees, 50% workers. Where's the other percent there? It's people who aren't retired but don't work, infants, things like that. But here you'd need a contribution rate of 10%. But if you're Alberta, you roughly have 19% retirees and 52% workers. And you might look at that and think, no big deal, basically the same, a couple percentage points here and there. But no, you just crank out the simple math there and you get a much lower contribution rate. So demographics are an incredibly powerful driver of pensions in general and how much needs to be contributed into them. But of course, all this is a forward-looking exercise. And based on my analysis, the Alberta share of all future earnings within the CPP, it's about 18.4%. But the share of Alberta benefits received out of spending from the plan, it's about 15.8%. And it's that gap that mechanically allows for a lower contribution rate. Now, there are large uncertainties. I mentioned LifeWorks, they have 5.9. In my analysis on those numbers I just said, 8.6. And that's a big difference between these two numbers. Savings of 1425 at the high end from the LifeWorks report, or savings at the high end of 400 and change from mine. So there is some real uncertainty here. And so I'm not going to, I guess, beat around the bush too much longer. Let's talk about why my estimates are different than LifeWorks and why we both might be wrong. So first, the base CPP, it's 9.9% as a contribution rate. That's on the far left. They have a 0.4% cushion, leaving them with 9.5 to play with. And LifeWorks, having that $334 billion initial asset, that delivers a drop of 3.6%. So that's a big drop just from that alone. Now, LifeWorks was pretty conservative. They, in other dimensions in their analysis, they mirrored the CPP's assumptions in a lot of respects. And so the big difference for them is just the assets. For me, I make different assumptions that actually are more favorable to Alberta in terms of fertility rates and migration rates going forward. But my assumption on the assets of only getting 20% rather than 53% boosts the contribution rate up by 2.2%. So you can see the biggest reason for why LifeWorks and I have very different results comes right down to the assets. So let's talk about that. How do we determine how much a province receives if it withdraws? And I should say that any province can unilaterally withdraw, and there's no way within the legislation or within the Constitution as it is set up now to prevent it. The only question is how much would be paid out, and what would the structure of that pension be? And that's something where we need to talk about where assets come from. And pension assets come from, of course, contributions. We use some of the contributions to fund benefits, and we use another fraction of the contributions to accumulate savings into a fund. And over the whole history of the CPP, we save about 5 cents on the dollar. Some years it's higher. 2008, for example, was pretty high. It was nearly 20 cents on the dollar. But we take every dollar you pay in as a worker, some fraction of that is used to fund benefits to retirees today. And some other fraction is used to save within a fund. And so that's an important point. And keep this point in mind because it's the single reason why LifeWorks and I differ. And it's worth about $210 billion. So it's worth keeping in mind. That savings rate, how much of each dollar is used to accumulate into a fund? And why does that matter? Well, the Canada Pension Plan Act lays out what the withdrawing province would receive. And it has some language in there to say how much a province would receive. Unfortunately, the language is a little imprecise. Words tend to be, when you try and make them a mathematical formula, they can go in many different ways, but it's a pretty simple, intuitive approach. Step one, just tally up all the contributions made by workers in that province. Right? That's easy.
It should be.
Yeah, it's conceptually easy. There's some data issues. Step two, apportion investment returns. Right, and I'll talk about how that's how the language in the Act is laid out. That's not easy. Step three, you subtract all the benefit spending. That's easy. We got data on that. Just add it up. And step four, you apportion the operating costs, but it turns out those are pretty small, so don't matter all too much. Look at steps 1 and 3. Total contributions minus total expenditures. That's what we saw in the government's video, the 60 billion.
Okay.
That's the gap between these two things. I'm going to say 67 when we get to the relevant step in a bit. So it's step 2 that I've highlighted here. Apportion the investment returns of the CPP. That's really hard. Why is it really hard? Well, here's the relevant section of the Act. And I've underlined the relevant words. It says, take the part of the net investment return of the investment board blah, 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 that is derived from the contributions made by workers in that province. But it doesn't say how to do the derivations. And as you can imagine, there's lots of ways you could derive investment returns from contributions. And it's the ambiguity of that word derived that can lead to wildly different results. And this is where the savings rate matters, right? Where assets come from? Well, it's the saved portion of contributions. And if you look at the CPP, it's 5 cents on the dollar. But if you look just at Alberta contributions, and if you earmark them to fund just Alberta benefits, then you get a 36 cents on the dollar savings rate. And so LifeWorks implicitly is using the higher Alberta specific savings rate. So it's a dollar made by an Alberta worker, 36 cents of that saved within an Alberta specific fund in their analysis, and then 64 cents used to fund benefits to retirees in Alberta. Whereas the national plan, it's 5 cents on the dollar. And it's the approach on the left that I take. So I take the CPP as a national program. LifeWorks zooms in and looks at just the Alberta specific flows. Both are ways of deriving investment returns from contributions. And so it's hard to, I guess, evaluate objectively which one would be correct or not. There's no sense in which the Act tells you what that word derived means. And maybe I'll pause here to note that, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't comment on statutory interpretation or what the Supreme Court might say the word derived means. And there's legal processes and precedent around statutory interpretation that are relevant, but that's a big source of uncertainty. And it might be something where Alberta would need to have a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada, clarifying what the language in the Act means. Because if you're saving 5 cents on the dollar, or if you're saving 36 cents on the dollar, you're going to get a very different accumulation of assets over the span of 60, 70 years.
That's right.
Hugely important. Okay. I'm going to skip the math there.
I was hoping for the math.
Yeah. Recognizing the time, webinars, maybe I should have thought ahead and
you know what? That's okay. Are you okay to basically post this somewhere? Or is this available maybe on your website?
This can be posted. We can connect by email. Okay. No question. Yeah.
That would be great.
Portions of it are already on my website anyway, but absolutely. Okay. No question. So if you were a couple of months ago, you received a flyer from the engagement panel around the APP. And they did note one interesting historical fact on there around the language in Section 113. Because it's ambiguous, one might think, well, what did the original negotiators and politicians at the time think it meant? And the Premier of Ontario thought that the Premier of Ontario was negotiating whether or not to be a part of the CPP at all. So John Roberts, a condition for him agreeing was to have Section 113 in the Act. And the Premier said that his motivation for that section being included was that he wanted an option to leave at any point and be placed in precisely the same financial position as if Ontario had operated an identical but separate plan from the outset. And so at least in his mind, that's what this section meant. Now, again, I don't know how much relevance that means for how we would interpret the words today. That's a legal question. Maybe someone else can answer, but that's interesting because that corresponds to the LifeWorks interpretation. Right? If we were to literally ask, what amount would Alberta have had it operated its own thing from the start, accumulating its own contribution spending gap all this time? Then you'd get something close to the LifeWorks number.
Yeah.
And so that's a point there. A counterpoint, and this is why this policy issue is kind of a mess. There's not a lot of clarity on any file. A counterpoint to Robarts' interpretation of things today is that CPP didn't work the way it does today back in the 60s. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, and most of the 1990s, it was very different. Very different. How is it different? Well, quick historical aside, the CPP, anytime it had excess funds, it would not invest them the way we do today. It would not buy infrastructure or bonds on equity markets around the world. It would loan the excess to provinces. It would buy provincial bonds. That's it. Very boring, low return strategy.
Yeah.
It just took the excess, bought provincial bonds. But it bought provincial bonds in perfect proportion to the contributions that provincial workers made to the fund. So if you're a province with 16% of all contributions, roughly Alberta, then 16% of all the excess would be invested in your province's bonds. That means that 16% of all the income ever derived in the CPP fund would be paid for by Alberta. So historically, that derived from means contribution shares. And if that's the interpretation we apply today, then you get my formula. Okay. So we have a huge difference, a huge range of things, which means there's a lot of scope for negotiation, I guess, politically and disagreement and so on and so forth. So what do I get? I get between 120 and 150 billion. LifeWorks 334, and that is a big difference, no question. But even if you get 120, that yields that potential to lower the contribution rate by 1.3 percentage points. Not nothing, or as high as 1.6, depending on how much cushion you wanted. So even with this interpretation, there is absolutely reasonable scope for people to agree or disagree or favor or not the pension plan, because there's still benefits, material benefits in the plan. But there are risks, and I'll just take maybe 1 or 2 minutes to cycle through a couple of the quick risks because we're running low on time here. And these are risks that I don't want to say risks that are unmanageable, but they're certainly risks to keep in mind. One is, we talked about the legal stuff, so I'll move on. One is we'd have to set up our own tax collection agency to basically administer. And so there's risks in terms of our ability to set that up. It might be a lot more expensive than the potentially $2+ billion at the high end that LifeWorks was estimating. But, this also aligns with other objectives that one might want to achieve. I know, Carrie, we were talking earlier on about a separate Alberta Revenue Agency, whether, that's something to continue or not. So that's like joint with this, but you'd need some entity to collect and administer the fund. But maybe the CPP would do it for us, right? That's also another possibility, but that's a risk there, administrative risk, let's say. The second is political risk. And I don't know if this gentleman here rings a bell, but this is one of the more interesting Alberta premiers ever, Aberhart, in the late 1930s. And I say interesting because he tried a lot of things, a lot of big reforms, banking in particular. He created his own currency for Alberta, prosperity certificates, lots of things where if he had a large pension fund, then I think he would have done a lot more crazy things. Sorry, that was my own personal bias. Sorry, crazy in my eyes. But what I mean here is to say that a provincial plan would be subject to decisions of a particular premier at some point in the future. An Alberta plan would be subject to unilateral changes in policy by a future Alberta government. They could change the contribution rate up or down. They could change the benefit amounts up or down unilaterally. And that means we do need to think about whether or not the plan being operated by someone that we trust. And that could be someone in any party. I mean, you can trust politicians that have policy disagreements, but you also have to think about, well, what about the time we get a premier that you don't trust? What are the institutional protections in place? And with the Canada Pension Plan, it's kind of unique in the world in how it's established, because it's not something that's strictly federal and it's not provincial either, it's joint. And so changing the CPP requires 2/3 of the provinces representing 2/3 of the population to agree. And so no prime minister can really unilaterally change the CPP in a way that a premier could. So there's political risk.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So if we were to do this, then somewhere in the legislation that brings this out, we have to have a set of rules. And one of those rules might be by committee, or it needs to be a separate entity or something like that.
Well, the thing about legislation is that no legislature can bind a future one. Think about a premier 50 years down the line that wants to enact a change. They would just repeal the legislation and implement a new one reflecting the change they'd like to see.
Yeah.
Now, a counterpoint to this is that there are some, and I guess I'll point to former Alberta Finance Minister Ted Morton, and my former colleague here at the University of Calgary, is a professor here in the political science department. He would say that there is scope for provinces to have constitutional level protections, even for province specific laws.
Okay.
I don't have expertise there, but that's the kind of interesting detail to think about. Having an Alberta plan with constitutional level protections, that's interesting. Just implementing something in with a piece of legislation that could be repealed at any point, that's higher political risk. So one, I guess, final point, and then we can conclude, is, having me present scenarios is one thing. There's all sorts of potential futures that you can explore on your own. And this is a plug for my
Absolutely.
My website, non-revenue generating. So I'm pure, just click on financesofthenation.ca, and there is an Alberta Pension Plan simulator. And it's a simulator that the underlying data and math, if you will, is similar to the government's. You can replicate theirs. There's a little button for the government scenario, and you can turn the dials. If we have a higher investment return, maybe you think Alberta could invest better than the CPP, and you choose your own adventure here and see what the implications are. So maybe that's a good point to end on. So I'll just, thank you again, Carrie, for the opportunity, and happy to.
That's great. So there's definitely how you can get a hold of Trevor if you have anything. We've also got a little ticker going along the bottom. He's on X or Twitter, and you can go to trevortombe.com, or is that right? That's right too.
That is right.
Yep. Yeah. So, as well as Finances of the Nation, of course, too. So lots of questions, lots of really good questions that are I guess they're kind of opinions and bias and all that. And again, what we wanted to do is at least present the facts. We wanted to present where the idea of the CPP came from, where APP, why they're planning on doing our own pension plan, and what happens, I guess. And I'm glad you brought this up. So with one of the risks that is worth noting is that if Alberta was to declare its own sovereignty and basically say, we've had enough with Canada, we're going to do our own finance, we're going to do everything on our own, there is that little bit of risk in terms of the of pension, as well as any risk associated with starting a new country, if you want to do that, right? Like there's all about the policing, and we've talked a little bit about military and stuff in previous broadcasts as well. But pension for sure is something that people are, because they've without making it sound corny, they have a vested interest in it, right? They really have put money in, and they want to make sure that they've got that money coming back out. And if we're putting money into CPP and then we've decided, no, we're going to take that money and put it into an APP. And like you mentioned, that is in the provincial wheelhouse. And likewise, it could be in the country of Alberta, or Republic of Alberta, if you want to call it that. And then what happens if somebody goes and moves somewhere else? So we've had this question before, and I guess the simplest answer of this is, if you live in Canada right now and you decide to retire in Costa Rica, how do you get your pension? It follows
by direct deposit.
That's right. And it follows you. And that's exactly what would end up happening in this. And I think that's one of the questions that most people are afraid of, is that, well, if I'm working in Alberta and then I move to BC, then now I've got two, or maybe I just have put all my eggs into the APP. You know what? That is something that will be discussed and will be tabulated and put into, like we said, legislation. They will decide what options there can be. And then if it goes to a referendum, then we get to vote on it, right?
Yeah, and I guess just for context, there's roughly $1 billion in CPP payments flowing to non-Canadian residents.
Okay, that's
because they would have worked some number of years. They qualified for it, so fair enough. Yeah. That would be a feature of the APP too. Yeah. And either it would be done where you would just be receiving it by direct deposits, but there's also like transfer agreements that pension plans have with each other.
That's right.
So Quebec and the Canada Pension Plan is a great example of that. Yeah. If you work your whole life in Quebec and then retire to Kelowna, you collect the CPP, not the QPP, even though you paid all your contributions in Quebec. Or if you work your whole life in Alberta and retire to Montreal, you collect the QPP.
Yes, that's
right. You collect wherever you want, wherever you retire. And then the two plans, they have an agreement and they make themselves whole on the back end. And pension plans have these agreements, and the CPP has several international ones. Now that would take time to lay that out. But people moving around and retiring in a place that's different from where they worked is not an unknown problem here, and it's got an obvious solution here. So I don't view that as that itself as a real relevant risk or challenge for the APP. I mean, it would take time to negotiate these agreements, but we have several models to follow from. We just take a carbon copy of what already exists. And
so a question that has come up too in the past, and maybe you actually know the answer. So we talk about, you're married, you both retire roughly at the same time, blah blah blah, and you're used to getting a certain amount of money from the government, and one of you dies. What happens in that scenario?
This is not a question that I will answer, because it is a very individual specific thing. That this is why we have financial planners to help people in their individual set of circumstances. Well, and I'll say generically that pensions have different provisions around how much they will pay to spouses. What fraction of your pension will go to your spouse varies from full to none. How long that lasts is guaranteed for different periods of time. The nature of your CPP benefit in that specific case, there are different types of CPP benefits that you can receive. So I don't want to mislead anyone by saying what would happen, other than the amount received by a spouse is something where there's a lot of variation across plans and even within plans.
And all I really wanted to get out of that is that that's the way it works with CPP in terms of pension. And likewise, if you've invested in your own RSP, whatever else, plans too. Spousal, blah, blah, blah. But if we ended up doing this as our own Alberta pension plan, could we have some legislation in there that basically says that if your spouse dies, you could still end up getting a better portion or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in order to, and I didn't say this in the presentation, so apologies for that. In order to receive any amount from the CPP, so the asset split, to get any amount, the separating province needs to establish a comparable plan.
Okay.
quote, comparable. Now,
Yeah.
that word comparable was chosen deliberately at the time to not be identical. So the two plans can differ, but they can't differ that much. And so that's a choice that Alberta would make. It could leave and have a basically identical plan in every respect with just with a lower contribution rate. And that would be comparable. Whether it adjusts other aspects of the plan might open some risks to be deemed uncomparable to the CPP, in which case Alberta wouldn't receive anything, in which case it would be very hard to sustain a separate plan. So if this is something that's proceeded on, then we should have in mind that an Alberta pension plan on the benefit side is basically the same in every respect compared to the CPP.
Yeah, apples and oranges. No, I get it. That does make sense, because then, especially if people are going to be voting on this, they do have to decide, well, maybe it just literally comes down to the percent that's being taken off your paycheck and the amount that you get in the end. Because I know that's another question that people have asked. It's like, well, if Alberta had its own pension plan, how much money would I make at the end of the day? And it's like, well, do we even have those numbers right now? Like if people are, let's say, maximum $1,200 is what the Canada Pension Plan for most people, but realistically they're getting $800 a month. If we change the amount of money going in, or we kept it at the same and invested that extra 2 or 3%, what would your, again, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but would we be in a better position for take-home pay, or would we be the same, or would we be less?
So my numbers and LifeWorks numbers assume that the Alberta benefits would be the same.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But workers would contribute less. And so the benefit would be accruing to you while you work.
That's
the benefits would be the same, but you pay less to get them.
That's right. So so people could, in theory, let's say the rule of thumb should be that you take 10% of your net home pay and you invest it, right? That's the idea. So let's just say you did in 10% is CPP and that's all you do. Now let's say you've got 8%, and now you can take that extra 2% and you invest it somewhere else, whether maybe you top up your RSP or you do something like that. You might be better off in the end net once you retire.
Yeah. So in that case, if you use your savings in a way that
or you just buy a big truck,
or you could, spend it on a nice vacation. So just to give you a sense of the magnitudes, the LifeWork annual benefit is $1,400 at the top end.
Okay.
That's like when you earn enough to hit the maximum. My top end is $400, which is considerably less. So it's about $1,000 a year difference, but $400 a year versus $1,400 a year. That's the range that you should have in mind for what that lower contribution rate means.
Yeah.
Now, $400 a year might not sound like a lot, but the magic of compound interest is what it is, that would accumulate to something over time. I might be mistaken, but I'm confident enough to say it out loud that for a young worker, in my analysis, from their perspective at age 18, the present value of all of the savings for them at a 8.6% contribution rate, that's equivalent to about $16,000 for them at age 18.
Okay.
So much larger when, if you think about it in future value terms. So yeah, I guess the answer to your question, what exactly the magnitude is would be varied. But if you have a lower contribution rate today, then my estimates are your take-home pay is $400 less, and there's uncertainty around that. The LifeWorks is, I'm sorry, $400 a year less, and then the LifeWorks is $1,400 a year less, and there's uncertainty around that. So that's the scale you should have in mind, somewhere between like, $40 to $100 a month.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. So in the end, even just using that just as a number, Alberta is in a better position to do their own, because in the end, everybody does take home a little bit less or a little bit more, right?
Yep, that's fair enough. And then the risks are what to keep in mind. So I definitely don't dispute the potential for benefits from the APP, and then we need to think about, are those benefits worth the costs in terms of risk? And that's kind of the weighing of pros and cons that we should do for every policy choice or every choice we make, even in our own day-to-day life. But yeah, from the benefit side, that lower contribution rate, it's a meaningful amount, even at the lower estimate of what I put forward.
So now here's some variables that maybe you have taken into consideration and maybe not, but I just want to throw these numbers out just to see, right? So I'm not sure exactly what you were using for migration or immigration numbers into Alberta, but as you know,
population per year.
Okay, so as you know, the federal government has now said that instead of bringing in 40,000 new immigrants a year, they're doing 400,000. However, they've actually brought in 400,000 new immigrants since September, right? Where those people are going, and if they're actually being part of the pool of workers, and whether or not they're actually getting pension or putting into pension. And then, of course, I know the federal government is even talking about changing some of the rules so that if people come in, they'll be able to vote within a certain amount of time. They'll be able to take EI in a certain amount of time. They'll be able to take pension in a certain amount of time. That to me is a bit of that's a very big what if, right?
Yep, I would agree. And this is why the Alberta Pension Plan Simulator has a dial for the migration flows.
Even better.
Yeah. I make a certain assumption, and LifeWorks makes a certain assumption. And if you crank that inflow up.
So where do I want to go for that?
Yeah. So on the right-hand side there, you see Alberta Pension Plan Simulator. About the 5th or 6th bullet point.
This one here. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So give it a sec to load. There it is. And then, so that's just, it pops up with a default. If you look at demographic assumptions,
which is where?
So,
this one.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay.
And then there's net migration.
Oh, yes.
Rate.
Okay. Yeah.
And then you can increase that to Alberta's population just from migration alone, rising to 1.8, change mortality. And then you can see what effect it has on the plan. So it turns out that because migration tends to be younger people, that does generate an additional advantage to a pension plan, if you will. Now, in this case, international migration, I don't separate relative to interprovincial. And that moving from BC to Alberta, moving from Ontario to Alberta, big flows that we're seeing today. That's really what I'm thinking more of intuitively, because that's where there's a lot of variation.
No, and that's
over time. And the international flows, like the uptick that we've seen over the past year, a big chunk of that is non-permanent residents. So who wouldn't be factored into any of the CPP, wouldn't be eligible or contributing.
Yeah.
Actually, I shouldn't. I'm pretty sure that's true. Yeah.
So
I might be wrong on that.
Here's another question that I don't even know if we could even dial it in or whatever. So a lot of these pensions, people are asking, so where are these investments? Are they going internationally? Are they kept in the home province? Are they kept federally? Are they kept within North America? And I guess it just depends on the group that's actually looking after the funds. Now, my question would be, can that be heavily influenced or changed by federal government policy in such that the federal government now says, yada, yada, because of climate change, we are now going to get rid of all the hydrocarbons in all of Alberta. And so now we're going to be heavily investing in solar panels and wind, blah, blah, blah. And so the numbers based upon those investments would definitely change.
Yep. Yeah. And this is where you could reasonably think about Alberta having higher investment returns than the CPP. I think one of the critiques of the CPP, Andrew Coyne actually makes this on a semi-regular basis. It's that the costs of the CPP as a fund are higher than the operating costs of many others. Yeah. And so that's shaving meaningful amounts off of annual returns. So running a fund more efficiently increases the returns.
Yeah.
In terms of the allocation of investments, so right now the mandate of the CPP Investment Board is clear. To maximize returns, subject only to having the cash flow we need to operate the fund.
Yeah.
And that's different than Quebec's, which is to generate returns, yes, but also facilitate local economic development within the province. And that dual mandate does come with lower returns because you're trying to balance different objectives. And so that means lower returns to the Quebec pension fund itself. With respect to the federal government, it can't unilaterally change the mandate of the investment board. That would require 2/3 of the provinces with 2/3 of the population agreeing.
Yes. Okay.
So you could change the mandate without unanimous agreement. So there could be scenarios where there are changes to the mandate and some provinces don't agree. Indeed, when we set up the modern CPP, and when I say modern, I mean 1997, BC and Saskatchewan didn't agree. They said no. But we had 2/3 of the provinces representing 2/3 of it, so it happened anyway.
Yeah.
So there can be changes to the investment mandate without unanimous support, but it can't be just unilateral federal support.
Yeah. So one more question. I mean, there's tons of questions that are definitely biased, and I just again want to just deal with the facts. This is a question that's been posed to me numerous times, and I'm going to get you to answer it first. And then I will answer it if it's totally different from what you're saying.
Sounds good.
So if Alberta decides to go ahead with our own pension plan and we yank that money out, doesn't matter if it's 20 billion all the way up to 360 or whatever amount, right? Because there's that much of a range. If we pull that out, what happens with the rest of Canada in terms of their contributions to CPP?
Great question, because that is certainly relevant for people elsewhere in the country. It's also relevant for the discussion here in Alberta too. There is a cushion within the CPP, and that cushion is about 0.4 percentage points. And so the issue is, would an Alberta withdrawal from the CPP eat up that full cushion? And there's two things. You lose some of the CPP assets when Alberta withdraws, and you also lose a disproportionately large number of young people. And so that you're losing the fact that Alberta workers have a larger share of earnings within the fund than they do future benefits received from the fund.
Okay.
My estimates are that if Alberta were to receive more than 22% of the CPP fund, then the rest of the country would need to increase their contribution rates.
Yeah. And that's basically what I've said. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So if it's under that, no. If it's over that, yes. So it does depend on that asset split. Okay.
And so that is definitely the number. And to me, it's been, well, if we take out our proportion, it's like, you go through a divorce settlement or you go through a business situation that you're splitting your assets, and then you decide whether or not you're going to be adding more in order to top up. Or the other thing that I would say to the provinces is that, you relied a lot on what Alberta was doing and helping you out. Now, say a province like Ontario and Quebec, let's explore more of your natural resources in order to offset some of that and top up. And maybe that takes 10 years, maybe it takes 20 years. But I think that's the kick in the butt that for a lot of other provinces to say, you know what, we've been relying on Alberta, or we've been relying on Canada as a whole for so long, and yet we should actually be out on our own doing our own stuff. So,
no comment for me on that perspective. But I'll stick with the facts here. That if it's a 20% asset withdrawal, that's the number that I land on in my read of the act.
Yeah.
Then the CPP wouldn't even need to increase contribution rates.
Perfect.
And if it's the LifeWorks share of 53%, then it would need to increase contribution rates by about 1 percentage point.
Okay.
And for context, and this might be or might not be relevant, but I'll say it anyway, that the Quebec pension plan is already about 0.9 percentage points higher for the same benefits.
Oh,
Because
that I did not know. Okay.
They had a lower investment return and
Yeah.
they aged more quickly. So they had some risks and they had to ratchet up their contribution rate to compensate. So then the CPP and the QPP would be on similar levels. So even in that scenario, I do think it's incorrect for those in Alberta, and I've heard them claim that a withdrawal would be devastating for the CPP. I mean, anyway, so it's at 22%. That's the magic number to I guess keep our eye on.
Well, that's great. That's amazing information. Thank you so much, Trevor, for joining us. And again, the facts. And again, go on to the LifeWorks financesofthenation.ca. Or I said LifeWorks, but you know what I'm talking about, just Finances of the Nation website. Go and play around with that, see if you can make some numbers work in your benefit, and use that as a tool to kind of decide whether or not this is something that you think the Alberta should be going towards or not. The other thing that I do want to point out too is, of course, go to the Alberta Prosperity Project.com site, go to the events. And I know there's a couple of people that have posted up. Well, I see the Orange Group is doing some pension plan posts and or actually meetings. And great that you're having a webinar. But why don't you guys have meetings? We just started our meetings, and so this week again we've got Barnwell coming up, which is near Lethbridge on Friday. And then we've got ones going in later in Czar. We've got Westlock. And I know we're looking at places in Calgary proper and in Edmonton, as well as more centralized Red Deer or Olds. Those will all be posted on the website. So please use that and get involved. And we've said that right from day one is if you want change, don't let someone sit back and do it for you. Get involved and make the change happen for you. And with that, I'm going to say it again. Thank you so much, Trevor. We do these weekly webinars every Wednesday. And of course, next Wednesday, I have to call this up here, we have Ken Drysdale. If you don't know who Ken Drysdale is, he is the chairman of the National Citizens Inquiry. And we had him doing a webinar back in, I believe it was in September. And a lot has happened in terms of what's happened with the government. And a lot of things have changed. And we want to find out what has actually happened with the National Citizens Inquiry and pros, cons, and what we can do going further. So that's next Wednesday, February 6th. So we ask that you please join us then. And with that, again, thank you so much for your intimate knowledge, Trevor. And we'll definitely have you back again as the pension referendum gets closer. And maybe
we're great to be here and look forward to connecting again.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you so much. Everybody watching, thank you so much for spending the hour and 24 minutes. If you can, share, and even send a message off to Trevor and let him know what you think of the presentation. And with that, I'm going to wish you guys good night. And we'll see you again next Wednesday. Thank you very much.